Okay, we're back here going over estate and gift taxes once again. Alright, just to kind of summarize what we've seen so far, we have a federal estate tax, also a federal gift tax that applies. Husband and wife, they can give an unlimited amount to each other. They can give an unlimited amount to charity. It's called the unlimited charitable deduction. This is called the unlimited marital deduction. All right. And then on top of that, they can give to as many people as they want. Any person, it does not have to be related to them. Up to $15,000 per year. 15,000. So here's person 1, here's person 2, here's person 3, here's person 4, here's the bear. Yep. 15,000 each year, each calendar year. And then they have other exemptions. They can pay tuition for people, such as their children, as long as they pay it directly to the institution. And they can pay medical expenses that are not covered by insurance. If it's reimbursed by insurance, then the exclusion does not apply. And again, they have to pay it directly to the healthcare provider in that case. So those are the big exemptions. The other big exemption that each of them have is 11,500 and what was it, $60,000 this year. Goes up every year with inflation. We also know that that exemption may not be permanent. It may be cut in half by about 2026 or so, because the legislation that sets that exemption was only effective for 10 years when it was adopted. So let's go down a little bit here and explore this a little bit. Let's say here's Bear, and his estate is worth $21,560,000, and let's assume that now he is single. Okay? And he passes away and he leaves everything. We'll just assume he leaves everything to his son outright, if he had a son. All right. He has an exemption from estate tax of $11,560,000, which means that $10 million of that is going to be taxed. That's the federal estate tax, and the rate of that is 40%. So that means that his estate or his trust will pay $4 million in federal estate tax 9 months after he passes away. Got 9 months to file the estate tax return and pay that tax. All right. Hopefully he's fairly liquid. Hopefully not all of his money is tied up in real estate or some type of limited partnerships or investments he can't sell easily, things of that nature, because you want to be able to come up with this $4 million of cash. Why do we have an estate tax? Why is there the federal estate and gift tax? All right. Well, the answer really goes back to the turn of the 19th, 20th century, back around early 20th century. We had a family out there, actually several families. One of them was called the Rockefellers, all right? And they accumulated a huge amount of wealth. All right? And there were others that were basically accumulating large amounts of more wealth. Another one of them was called J.P. Morgan. He actually gifted a lot of money to charity, as did the Rockefellers, of course, and others. All right, but basically, the estate tax, in my view, was put in place to basically make sure that we don't generate in this country what they had in England, which was basically lords and earls and things like that basically controlled most of the property in the country. All right, so it's basically a scheme of saying we don't want families to basically become basically control all the wealth in our country. We want to go ahead and put a limit on that. And so when somebody goes over whatever that estate tax limit is, we're going to tax them. Now, when I started practicing as an estate tax planning attorney, the exemption was only $600,000. Now, I know some of you will say, well, that was 1903, but no, it wasn't. That was 88 when I started practicing as an estate and gift tax attorney. All right. And the exemption slowly went up to $1 million after all the several tax law changes over time by 2001. And then President George W. Bush got elected, and that exemption went up to around 3.5 million. And then it went up above that. Then it went down after that, surprisingly. The 2001 legislation that increased it to 3.5 million was not permanent. And basically, in the year 2009, because Congress did not act, it was interesting, there was no estate tax that year. And there was a very rich person who passed away that year. His name was Steinbrenner. And anybody who knows George or knew George Steinbrenner knew that he owned the New York Yankees. Yeah. So basically, he was able to leave the New York Yankees to his children with no estate tax. Yeah. You would think Congress would fix that, but they had to act. They had to act proactively, not reactively. They couldn't put something in place retroactively because of constitutional concerns. But then 2010 came along, and basically the exemption got higher, and now we have this higher exemption amount. So, just to go back here, we've got all these exemptions that come to play. All right. And if someone had just left everything to a son, would have to pay some estate tax, would have to come up with the money to pay that, have the cash to pay that estate tax. And the reason we have the estate tax is because basically we don't want extremely wealthy people and their families to just accumulate wealth. The problem with the estate tax exemption is it can hit family farms and family small businesses. So then the question is, well, what's a family farm? Used to be a family farm might be 40 acres, but very few 40-acre farms are profitable anymore. In fact, if you don't have at least probably 500 or 1,000 acres, it's kind of hard to make a lot of farms profitable at this point. In addition, small businesses, what is small? There are a lot of businesses out there that are worth, let's say, $100 million, right? They're formed by somebody, they've done quite successful, they're not publicly traded, they're all owned by one person or one family or something like that. And is that small? And how do they raise the cash for that? Let's say all of their net worth, or almost all of it, is tied up in this family business, and the person, or let's say it's a husband and wife, and they die, and there's about $23 million that's exempt from tax, but because of their 11.5 million exemptions each, but the rest of that is taxed at a pretty high tax rate. So you got 77 million taxed at 40%. Well, that's easily $30+ million that has to come up with. And they may not have the cash for that if it's all tied up in real estate or a closely held business, family farm, or the like. So there's a lot of public policy discussions that are always happening up in Washington. What is the appropriate size of the exemption, and what's the appropriate rate of tax? We have a pretty high exemption amount now. I would kind of guess that there will not likely be making that exemption permanent. It will probably go back to half of its what it is. And the reason is there's going to be some pressure on Congress to basically pull down the size of the deficit, even reduce the size of the federal debt after the coronavirus and all the basically taking the official federal debt from $22 billion to probably 30 billion within a few years here. So there'll be some pressure to raise taxes, and one of the ways that they'll probably do that without necessarily affecting the economy in a big way is probably letting that estate tax exemption go to half. Okay. So, there are a lot of things we can do with the estate tax. Let's give another example here. Alright, so here's Bear. And let's say Bear is worth $50 million. Alright. And Bear, we'll say, is a widow. Sorry, my dear wife, I killed you off. Alright. And he has a son. And we'll say his son's name is Johnny. Johnny Bear. Okay. And Bear and his son, we'll say, is 30 years old. And Bear went out and married someone, and let's give her a name. We'll call her Jezebel. Yeah. And we'll say Jezebel is 40 years old. Okay. So, second marriage for him. He's worth 50 million. We'll assume Jezebel doesn't have a lot to her name. And we'll assume for purposes of this example that Bear is 60 years old. Alright. So, here we are. We're going to go down here and illustrate this a little bit more. Here's Bear, $50 million. Alright. And what is Bear going to do if he passes away? Oh my gosh, coronavirus hits. He dies early. Alright. Well, he can leave to his son that 11,580,000 or 60,000, whatever it is. That's estate tax free. And Johnny Bear, Johnny's not very motivated, we'll say, to make his mark in life. And he likes to give a lot of money to his friends and party and all that. So, going to put it into a trust for Johnny Bear, and Johnny Bear is going to get income. Maybe it's an incentive trust that matches the income that he makes, pays for his health care, pays for to have a place to live, but basically doesn't give him too much because don't want somebody living off the trust. But then you got the rest of this money. What are you going to do with that? Now, remember that unlimited marital deduction that we had? Well, there's a couple types of trust that qualify for that. And the most common type of trust is called a qualified terminable interest property trust, Q-tip trust. Often used in second marriages situation when you're dealing with a lot of net worth. And we'll say into that trust is put the rest of his estate, which in this case would be 38,420,000. Right? And that trust says pay all the income to Jezebel every year for the rest of her life. All right? That's all it has to say. All right? It might say pay more if needed for her maintenance, education, support, and health care. You could invade the principle of the trust. All right? But basically it says pay all the income. Now a lot of times you might say pay the greater of all of the income or 3% a year. All right? That would be called a unit trust amount. That way, if it's invested in such a way that it doesn't generate a lot of interest and dividends, that's called distributable income types, then Jezebel's not going to complain because she's still getting 3% a year, and 3% of almost $40 million is $1.2 million a year. And of course this trust would likely increase in value as well. All right? Remember the trust here for Johnny. Once it's sheltered from estate taxes, it remains sheltered from estate taxes. All right? Now this Q-tip trust over here, we'll say that Jezebel, she dies when she gets to be 50 years old, about 10 years after Bear dies. Okay? Dies at 50 years. All right? And we'll assume that the value of the trust at that point is $50 million. And we'll assume that Jezebel's estate tax exemption is $6 million. We'll say $8 million with inflation after 10 years. So the estate tax exemption was lowered. It was cut in half because Congress did not want to keep it at the current level. Under the current law, it basically reverts back to a lower level. Her exemption is $8 million. And let's say that because of all the assets that were distributed to her, but she did a really good job spending them, that she only had about, we'll say $2 million of assets in her own name. So Jezebel's going to leave those assets to whoever she likes, probably her new husband, for example. Okay, all right, those are her own assets that she's leaving. But the $50 million that's in this trust, because she has not used up the full amount of her $8 million exemption, she's only used up $2 million of that, we get to use her exemption when she passes away. That means only $44 million, 50 minus the $6 million exemption that has not been used by her, 8 million minus the 2 million of assets that she did have. All right, that's 50 million minus 6. That's the amount that's subject to estate tax when she dies. So basically, under a Q-tip trust, all right, you provide for the spouse, and then it defers the estate tax until the death of the spouse. And we've already used up the exemption at that amount. We'll assume that the estate tax rate remains the same. That rate, by the way, has been as high in recent years as 55%, as low as 30%. But we'll assume that, hey, it's 40%, and that is going to be $17,600,000 of estate tax paid. And after the estate tax is paid, 44 million minus 17 million is going to be, let's see here, 26,400,000, and that's going to go to Johnny or to Johnny's trust for him. All right. So basically, we could do this type of situation where in a second marriage situation, you want to go ahead and benefit your son or your children, use up a big part of the exemption for that. And you don't have to use all the exemption. He could have just said, just put some of the exemption in here, put $2 million in here for Johnny. All right, and then the rest could go into a Q-tip trust, and that Q-tip trust basically defers the estate tax until later when the spouse dies. All right, these are very common techniques in terms of large estates. So here's a way of kind of putting it all together. Let's say the husband here, Bear again, and this time we'll have Mrs. Bear, and it's a first marriage situation. But Bear is worried about his wife getting remarried, and he's worth $60 million at this point. All right. What he does is he doesn't want his children to actually receive anything yet unless they need it, so he sets up a family trust. The $11,580,000 or whatever the estate tax exemption is goes into that trust. Anything over the exemption, which in this case 60 million minus the 11,580 is somewhere around 48 million plus, goes into the Q-tip trust for the wife, Mrs. Bear. Okay, but this family trust can also benefit Mrs. Bear. Right now, in this case, where Mrs. Bear is the beneficiary of two trusts, she's got a family trust. We'll just say that there's 12 million in it. We'll use round numbers. You got the Q-tip trust. It's got 48 million. That Q-tip trust has to pay all the income to her. All right. It can pay more if needed. All right. It cannot benefit anybody except Mrs. Bear. All right. But the family trust could benefit other people. It could say, oh, I want to provide for Mrs. Bear if she needs it, but I also want to provide for my daughters. So the family trust can have multiple beneficiaries. But the Q-tip trust during the wife's life can only provide for Mrs. Bear. If Mrs. Bear needs more money, which trust is it going to come out of? It's going to come out of the Q-tip trust. Let's say Mrs. Bear needs an organ transplant and it's going to cost $1 million and or $5 billion or something, and something unheard of. And in that case, it's going to be come out of this trust because no estate taxes have been paid on this money. There's no estate tax exemption that exists for this money yet. So we want to reduce the size of this trust if we can over time. All right. This trust, on the other hand, this family trust, we want to not basically have a spigot on it. It's got a spigot, and that spigot can turn off the money, and you can turn that spigot and say, okay, Mrs. Bear, we're going to give you some money, but not right away. I'm going to stop the video right now.